As we come to the end of this wonderful series, I'd like to thank each of you who have visited us here in the libraries. I hope you have enjoyed the lectures as much as I have, and I hope you will come back to the libraries often. I'd like to introduce one special guest, and I'm kind of reluctant to do this. We have so many special people with us today, but I'd like to welcome Dr. Philpott and Ms. Bailey to the library. Thank you so much for being here today. This series has grown out of a collaboration among the Auburn University Libraries, the AU Center for the Arts and Humanities, and the College of the Liberal Arts, AU Outreach, and the AU Sesquicentennial Committee. And it has been our pleasure to be the host and work with this wonderful group. I'd like to take just a moment of your time today to recognize the work of some of the library staff who have helped make these lectures so enjoyable for all of us. Joyce Hicks, who has made sure we had a comfortable place for each of these lectures and snacks for the receptions, in addition to providing expert assistance to the lecturers as they use the university archives to prepare for their presentations. Gary Hawkins and the staff in the Digital Resources Lab have worked before each lecture to ensure that the technology worked, and they've captured each of the lectures on video. We are all eager to see the final results of Gary's expert filming and editing so that the lectures will live beyond the end of this series and be available to students and scholars in the future. Dwayne Cox has handled a myriad of details and kept all of us organized and on track. And now it's my pleasure to turn to today's speaker, Nell Richardson, Auburn's First Lady and the Honorary Chair of Auburn's University Sesquicentennial Committee. As you know, when our students are doing research, they believe everything is on the internet, everything on the internet is true, and you can find it using Google. So I decided to test their theory and see what I could find about Auburn's First Lady, and this is what I found. On April 6, 1916, in an attempt to influence politicians and public opinion, suffragists Nell Richardson and Alice Burke, with their newly acquired kitten, Saxon, left New York and began to drive across and around the country to drum up support for voting rights for women. Well, about this time, one of our excellent instruction librarians pointed out to me that perhaps I should check my facts when I find things on the internet. And lucky for me, we were able to find somebody who knows Nell Richardson much better than I do. I'd like to invite Ed Richardson to come to the podium and introduce today's speaker. Dr. Richardson.
Thank you, Dean. She's always represented herself as a much younger woman than that. As the Dean said, this is our last month to celebrate our sesquicentennial, our 150th birthday. And I too would like to thank all of those that have worked so hard, not only in the preparation of this slideshow, but also for those that have worked on the other presentations that have come before us. I have asked staff to document the major events of this year so that those that come when we have our 175th birthday, which will be in 2031, they'll be able to look back and see what the issues were and the times and so forth. So certainly these presentations will be part of those benchmarks that we would use in 2031. I say we, those who will be in attendance will use those. Today it is with great pride that I introduce First Lady Nell Campbell Richardson. I am her husband of 45 years this month, so that's also a benchmark. Nell was born in Selma, Alabama, but moved to Montgomery when she was in high school and graduated from Sidney Lanier High School. Since I have considerable experience at that level, I can tell you without any hesitation that's the best high school that I've ever seen, visited, or been around anywhere in the country. I thought it was interesting that the mascot for the Sidney Lanier High School is the Poets, and their motto was, the pen is mightier than the sword, which I thought was appropriate for this presentation today. Nell delayed her college education after we were married until our two daughters, Merritt and Laura, were in school, and she graduated from Auburn University in 1983 with a BS in English and an MS in English education, again at Auburn in 1988. In addition, she did a little missionary work at the University of Alabama and received her certification in French there. And during her 21-year teaching career, she taught English at both the secondary and post-secondary levels. She's accomplished many things, all of those that I've mentioned and many more, while putting up with me for those 45 years, which, as you would imagine, is no small task, but also agreeing to follow me and move with me on 6 different occasions during my career. For the ladies in the room, you know that's not the most popular thing to bring up. In addition, our two daughters, Merritt, who is an Auburn graduate and also serves as a reading coach here in the Auburn City Schools. Our second daughter, Laura, is an Auburn graduate and is a CPA in Atlanta. We have 3 grandchildren, Seth, 12, Molly, 6, who's in attendance over here, and Gunnar, who's 8 months, who couldn't quite make it today. He's in Atlanta. So Nell became interested in those that lived in Auburn's house for the President and First Lady and found that this rich experience was not collected in a form for others so interested. So she started down this road, and I can confirm that she has worked hard for over a year on this project and made many sacrifices to finish it. So it's my pleasure to introduce a highly intelligent, determined, talented, compassionate, loving mother and grandmother, a person I hold in the highest regard and very proud to serve as her husband. I present First Lady Nell Campbell Richardson.
He wouldn't say that if he didn't get his breakfast every morning. I'd like to also thank Joyce Hicks. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. First of all, I'd like to thank Joyce Hicks. She started pulling stuff for me over a year ago and just been a great friend. John Varner and Dwayne Cox in the office, and Photographic Services, Jeff Etheridge, Dana Bradford. Just so many people to thank. And I'm so grateful, Beth Weed and Don Richardson in the President's office. I think Beth finally realized that I really was going to have to jump off of a building if she didn't find somebody to help me with the PowerPoint. So the light clicked, but it only clicked about 8 weeks ago. And I got my friend, my artist, my guru with the PowerPoint, just the most wonderful young woman, Laura Walker. And I want her to come because I can tell you absolutely that without her coming 8 weeks ago, this would not be happening today. Second, I would like to say that I hope you're not expecting to hear only about the ladies who've served this university as First Lady. My interest in this project was first expressed as an interest in the ladies who lived in the President's home before me, and there are 9 of these ladies now. But the President's home we have lived in is the new President's home, so there were several First Ladies who did not live in this home. And that was so long ago, I thought, let me just stay with this home because it's been there for 66 years. And this is the 2006, the 150th birthday of the founding of the liberal arts college that has become the Auburn University we know. So I started researching, writing about the First Ladies of the President's home, and I found that after you say they were born, they married, how many children they had, and that as official hostesses for Auburn University, they gave a lot of dinner parties. What else could you say? Well, I remembered then my Professor Bert Hitchcock, and he once said many times and drilled into us, Southern literature is always about place. And so I thought, well, that's it. This is about this place, this hill. Now, how did we get on this hill? How did this house get here? Who decided to put it here? And what has happened in this place in these 66 years? So that's what I decided I would focus on. And believe me, I think you're going to see a lot of change. You'll be amazed what's happened in 66 years. I've written a book, And believe me, a book is not a PowerPoint. So what we had to do is I began looking for pictures, trying to find pictures, writing letters to the relatives and the living first ladies like Mrs. Bailey, who's with us, to see if they would find some pictures for me and tell me some little stories. And I've just had wonderful response with that. But it was difficult to match up the pictures, some of which had no date and no information on the back, with any kind of narrative that was going on in the book. So believe me, it was also different than to go back after you got the PowerPoint done and write a script for the power of the slideshow. So you've actually got 3 products here, and I hope they all come together in a very fun way, because we want this to be fun, but we want it to be informative too. And I hope you'll be able to see that the structure and purpose of the book is to talk about Auburn University and then the President's Home as part of that larger setting of Auburn University. And you will see the mission of Auburn University coming through very clearly. And I think that mission is just clear to most scholars who know a lot more about the history of Auburn than I do. And it's about scientific research, and I want you to keep in mind that we're going to begin and end with scientific research. So you can see before you the etching of the home, which I found with no information on it, but the artist who did it, I wish I knew him or knew somebody who knew about him, because it's a fabulous etching, and it really should be matted and hung somewhere. It's gorgeous. I also want you to really think, too, about the president's wives, the first ladies, because this really is about them, too. And I want you to keep in mind that as you watch this, the developments of Auburn through the history of the setting of the president's home and the home itself, especially through the presidents who have come to Auburn to serve that mission of Auburn, and bring in their wives, perhaps unwillingly, and their children, and certainly unwillingly. And you will see the role of the wives change as dramatically as the campus has changed over the 66-year history of the President's Home. I hope you enjoy it. And now we'll go to slide 2. This is the table of contents of the book, and it's the outline of the presentation. We could really talk an hour about each of these. We left so much on the cutting room floor, you may as well say, or you could say. And so what to put in, what to leave out was just real hard. We were in here late last night cutting, throwing out. Because we have to squeeze it up to some kind of presentable form. But the President's Home is set on about 11 acres of gently rolling lawn, and it faces Mel Street. That's a very famous professor of botany and geology in the 1890s. And it has a panoramic view of the campus. Dr. Duncan, who built the home, could certainly watch from that hill the progress and continually changing landscape, as perhaps Dr. Philpott, who's with us, can tell us. He may have stood on that porch as well and watched the continually changing landscape of the campus of Auburn University. Now, slide 4. I hope you can see what that is. I thought that this picture of the Jude Collins Smith Museum was applicable here because Auburn first started as a liberal arts college. And the President's Home used to be first in coming into Auburn from the South. It was the first landmark, but now that's been taken over by, that place has been taken over by the museum. But guess what? Museum's fixing to lose its first place status because the research park will be the first beautiful major landmark of Auburn University. And I want you to keep in mind that the setting of the President's Home and the new research park are connected in an amusing way. I think you'll enjoy it. This farmhouse first was on the site of the President's Home before East Alabama Male College was established. And here, Dr. Darby was a pharmacist of sorts, and he also was a teacher of science, and he taught the girls of Auburn Masonic Home as well as the boys of East Alabama Male College in the same classes because he thought girls could do just as well in science as boys could. And he also mixed medicines. He had a prophylactic fluid which you could use to wash out the wound and drink, which was very popular in the Civil War for preventing all sorts of things. And guess where he made it? On the hill that the President's home is now set on. That's where he had his lab. This is a picture of one of the first labs at Alabama A&M. Wasn't Dr. Darby's lab, but we keep thinking we can maybe find where he brewed this stuff and market it again, find some of it stashed away. That fluid was very useful in the Civil War. And I want you to think about the mission there, the mission of scientific research. And in thinking of Auburn as the first Alabama college to admit women, which it was, you might say that the setting of the President's home is where it all began with Dr. Darby and his scientific research for a practical use and his teaching both boys and girls. Now, when you look at slide 7 and you see the barn and the prized bull, well, I don't think the prized bull is in there. He may be. That may be the prized bull. We found lots of prized bulls, and we couldn't decide which one might fit that time period. But the prized bull and his barn were on the lawn of the President's home. And the first agricultural experiment station were all there on the lawn in front of that farmhouse. Because in 1905, John Frederick Duggar, the third director of the Ag Experiment Station, lived in that home. And just down from that home, the oldest cotton crop rotation, still in continuous experiment, still stands. That's a picture I just took this fall. So if you think about this home as being representative of the service to agriculture and improving the lives of Alabama farmers, you'll see why the setting of the President's home is the place where it all began. In 1937, the Duggar-Darby farmhouse burned and made the site of the President's home available to Luther Duncan, 9th President of Auburn. Luther Duncan had graduated in agriculture in 1900 during the tenure of President Leroy Brown, 4th President of Auburn, who forced the college to give up attempts to retain the liberal arts curriculum with courses like Latin science and to introduce more intensive instruction in the sciences through the use of laboratory methods. Brown also opened the college to his daughter and 2 of her friends in 1890, making Auburn the first college to admit women in the state of Alabama. We beat Alabama on everything, don't we? Dr. Duncan capitalized on the New Deal of FDR and brought the necessary funding to Auburn for a massive and much-needed campus rebuilding campaign. We'll talk about all the buildings built during this Auburn reconstruction project when we come to the home section, but the President's home was the first building started. And from the hill, Dr. Duncan could see the women's dorms going up and the first stadium, which is now Jordan-Hare, which was also built by Dr. Duncan's, getting those funds from the New Deal. It's changed a lot, believe me, though, from the first. To celebrate the massive building campaign, the Greater Auburn Day event, attended by 3,000 people, was held in 1939. Dr. Luther Duncan climbed the stairs to Sanford Tower and rang the old bell that had been silent for many years. During the Duncan administration, the size of the campus tripled. The next quote comes from Mrs. Drawn, and Emily Lee Shuck was kind enough to record some of Mrs. Drawn's handwritten remembrances of Auburn.
For years when Dr. Duncan was president, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited Auburn to review the military cadet corps. Everyone in the county turned out to see him, even the small children and their nurses waving to him as they sat in front of the KA house. Dr. and Ms. Duncan, Ralph and I, and all of the trustees and college military officials waited in the reviewing stand, which was back of where the quad dining hall now stands, overlooking the drill field. Finally, here came the car bearing the president, accompanied by Senator Lister Hill and Representative Henry Stegall Sr. Much flag waving and cheers. Later, Mrs. Roosevelt also visited the campus for a military review, but she was quite late since she had stopped in Tuskegee Institute to visit friends.
Another part of the character of Auburn is military service. Of course, we know that. ROTC was here until the Vietnam War. It was required for all male students to be in ROTC. And if you see this, standing on the porch of the president's new home in the early 1940s, Dr. Duncan would have watched the campus explode with students, both before and after World War II. One of the three primary provisions of the Land Grant Act that altered the course of Auburn and when it became Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical College in 1872 was the military requirement. And here Ralph Drone Jr. was kind enough to send me some remembrances of his days as a child in the president's home.
Lots of buildings and developments today have obstructed the view from the portico of the president's home. But when I first knew the house, only fields and pastures stretched out for miles to the west, towards the Wire Road and beyond. I remember vividly the spectacular sunsets that were then a special feature of the prospect from the front terrace. They made me realize on what a fine site the house stands.
Thank you, Mr. Drone. Don't you like the picture we got of? This is such a marvelous find and had no information on it, but I realized what it is. On June 5th, 1954, the view from the president's home was altered in honor of the many men and women of API who had served the nation during World War I, II, and the Korean conflict. The Garden of Memory was sponsored by the Federation of Garden Clubs of Alabama in partnership with API, and it's fitting that Dr. Ralph Drone should have been the president to dedicate this extension of the campus and of the president's home setting. When Ralph Drone was serving the college under Dr. Duncan, he had endeared himself in the war effort to the town and to the college with his Christmas letter to the boys in 1943. Drone sent news to the battlefront from all members of the Auburn family, that is to say, beloved faculty and staff and Dr. Duncan. He spoke also of the glorious 1942 football season and of the team's outstanding players. Life in Auburn was different without the boys, Drone said, but no college in the country is making a finer contribution to the nation. This is a fisheye view. Jeff Etheridge, our photographer, loves to do these, and I want you to understand that the president's home is the extension of Sanford Hall, and it's where the president gets to continue his job after hours, greeting and working to raise funds for the campus. The home setting is preeminent and yet integral to the larger campus setting of the entire campus. And Luther Duncan was a dynamic president who was determined to bring the institution he had loved since 1896 into a prominence so permanent no one could deny its significance or its contribution to higher education in Alabama and in the nation. Before the end of his life, President Duncan would see the value of Auburn's research in many areas that improved the lives of farmers and expanded the Alabama economy significantly. I'm just going to allow y'all to read that, not hear my voice for a minute. The President's Home was the first WPA project started and work began November 24th, 1938. This building was designed by Warren Knight and Davis, Birmingham, Alabama, was built by Bryce Building Company, Birmingham, Alabama, for $38,412. It was first occupied by President Duncan. Needless to say, it's gone up in a little bit in value. This is from Sam Brewster's manuscript in the Light Archives, which Dr. Philpott may remember Sam Brewster. I'm not sure how long he was around. We do have one character that you will love, and he stayed for 30 years. His name's Jim Smith, and you look forward to his story. Okay. When Caroline Drawn left her memoirs, she listed some catalogs, some types of entertaining required of the President and the First Lady. She said there are parties for the trustees, for the town and gown, for the alumni and their wives, for the politicians, for the business executives, for the faculty, for the students. There are lots of parties, and this is a great one of Mrs. Drawn looking so beautiful and so young. And you'll never guess, that's the Dean of Home Economics. Isn't she sweet? Dana Catchell. And we have slide 18.
After Dr. Duncan's death, when my father served as acting president for more than a year, the house stood empty, and the driveway became a very convenient lover's lane for the students. One couple first got pinned in the driveway, and then later on they got engaged there. One of the first issues my father had to deal with when the trustees finally chose him president was this same couple's request to get married on the front lawn. Buildings and Grounds wasn't very enthusiastic about the project, and my father thought it would be a very bad precedent. Besides, he asked, what will that couple want to do next out there?
And the President's home is also the place where the President's family lives. The children and grandchildren of 9 presidents have made the house a home. They have played in the goldfish ponds and climbed up and down the grand staircase. Forts have been built under the dining room table and tents set up in the sunroom. Teenagers have lounged in the living room and go-karts have circled the lawn. This is the children's home, too, Mrs. Philpott, mother of 4 children, said in 1966. It's a home for all 6 Philpotts, not just a state home. The President's new home had been standing for more than 40 years when R.G. Millman described it in his 1991 booklet, The Auburn University Walking Tour Guide. The Martins were living here at the time, and the fire of 1994 had not happened. Millman's view of the house is called the Windshield Tour, and he describes the 6 stately wooden columns supporting the porch roof that extends across the entire front of the 2-story central block. And these columns today look the same as they did before sparks raced up one of them when the Muses lived there. They restored it nicely, didn't they? All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the home because if you go to the reception, you will get a tour of the home. A look inside the central block of the house reveals a double foyer extending from the front to the back with a grand staircase at the back and the door opening onto the screen porch. Guests coming to the President's home enter the front door of the home and are greeted by the President and his wife, often in a blinding sunset that floods the foyer. So the sunset's still there. Okay, here you see a picture of Dr. Ms. Drawn and Dean Cater standing outside the screen porch at the back of the house. You can compare the walkway patio and the patio of today. When the Philpotts lived in the house, the screen porch was changed to a Florida room with jalousie windows, and the house was air conditioned. But after the fire, the Muses must have decided to take the Florida room back to a screen porch. It's that today. Wish it were a Florida room. The sunroom beyond the living room has no bedroom above it, and this room's been seen lots of parties and people. It's the entertainment room, the room for music, for family gatherings. It's also been a lecture hall for student gatherings and a funeral parlor. The sunroom has seen tea parties and campouts. For official events, the fine furniture that replaced the rattan bought by Caroline Drawn in 1948 is pushed aside and round tables are set up for lots of dining. The same chandelier that hung above the casket of Dr. Duncan hangs today in the sunroom of the President's home. At the west end of the room, the grand piano purchased by Mrs. Muse has replaced the piano Dr. Martin played. And now that's being played by my granddaughter, Molly. The living room, standing between the long windows of the front living room, the American mahogany secretary was a gift to API from the estate of Alabama Governor Charles Henderson during the Duncan administration, and it's a 19th century reproduction. The grandfather clock in the foyer was part of the Henderson gift, and it had to be brought to Auburn in an unconventional way, which shows you that all gifts are not just easy. Some of them require a lot of trouble, and Dr. Duncan didn't have anything to send down to Troy to get it with except a World War II military vehicle, which has, the legend now has it as a hearse, but I think it was a military vehicle. It's a beautiful piece of furniture, but it too is a reproduction. In the dining room, the formal dining room and informal breakfast room have seen scrumptious dinners served to lots of guests. Over the years, lots of silver pots of steaming tea have been set beside the silver waiters laden with delicious desserts. Beyond the dining and breakfast rooms are the serving pantry and the kitchen.
My sister later was married from the house in the Episcopal Church downtown, but the reception was held at the home. No alcoholic beverages were served downstairs, but my father had decreed that a bar would be set up in an upstairs guest room, mostly for his older male friends. My assignment was to go through the crowd and direct his friends to the bar. I was supposed to be discreet, but Miss Molly Hallfield Jones, a social leader of rather imposing appearance, overheard me. She created quite a stir in the crowd by demanding to know in stentorian tones, but in fun, where a bar had been set up for the ladies who were attending the reception.
That American desk, walnut spinet desk right there, we have determined is the only real museum quality antique in the president's home, but it is quite valuable. In the kitchen, which was completely remodeled after the fire, there are new cabinets, granite countertops, and a white tile backsplash hand-painted with various wildflowers. This artwork of Montaigne Matheson enhances the kitchen, as do several of Mrs. Matheson's oils placed throughout the home by Mrs. Muse enhance the home. The kitchen now is primarily used by caterers, but when the Philpotts lived there, Dr. Philpott often cooked.
Jim had many duties, including hoovering the downstairs with a vacuum cleaner and serving as the college chauffeur. Furthermore, when I arrived at my teenage years, my parents, probably in desperation, put Jim in charge of me. One of his duties was to get me up in the morning so I could go to school. It was, I'm embarrassed to recall, not an easy task. On most school days, it took him at least 2 trips upstairs. On the first trip, he would make me get out of bed, and on the second trip, he would wake me up where I had gone to sleep on the floor.
And you can see the stairs he had to go up and down. And now those stairs go up to the bedrooms and down to the cellar, which is filled with wine for all of the bars we set up, for all of the events that we have. So those stairs you might take note of when you go through the house today. Next to these stairs is a small den which has been used through the years as a private place for the president's family. We have 2 lovely pictures of Dr. and Mrs. Philpott in that den, which we'll show you when we come to that section. This room is recently remodeled to make moving the furniture in and out easier. From a car window, and certainly from the front porch, the windows of the president's bedroom and bathroom are clearly visible and must be kept closed for privacy. On the back side of the master bedroom overlooking the screen porch is a small bedroom once occupied by Ralph Drone Jr., and out of which window he used to climb on his escapes. And then by Cable Philpott, it's now Cabell, I believe. I'm mispronouncing his name. Is that right, Jean? Cabell. It is now the choice bedroom of the Richardson's grandson, Seth, when he visits. In his windshield tour, Millman described the exterior of the president's home as having 5 gable dormers with a balustrade and chimneys at each end flanked with quarter-round lights, but the chimney at the kitchen end of the house exists only to provide symmetry for the structure. There's no fireplace there. The only fireplace in the home is the one between the living room and the large sunroom, and it's rarely used, but draws well and has in its chimney a small rectangular window visible from the south end of the house. This is the window of the upstairs bathroom, that serves the two bedrooms between. The bathroom is between the two bedrooms. And looking up from the formal garden, people are curious about this little window set into the chimney of a working fireplace. And don't we have some lovely pictures of that with marvelous shots of the Drons on the day they were retiring and leaving the home. And we have, I think, Mrs. Lee's Chuck, who used to assist the President's home, coming out of this beautiful shot of the door, and the shot of the President's home today. Now we come to Family Fun Day. On the lawn of this President's home where the bull and the barn used to be, we now every year have a Family Fun Day for all of the children of the employees of Auburn University. And in the gardens surrounding the President's home have provided a beautiful backdrop for family weddings, and they continue to please many people who come there. In the formal garden off the sunroom of the house, there's a small rectangular building that resembles a Roman bathhouse. And we found that was built in Dr. Duncan's time, and we found lots of references to it in its work in progress. We don't know who designed it or who built it, but we do know that Dewey Bedell laid some of the brickwork in it, and you might remember him from the Drake family, who had a store on Opelika Road in the 30s and 40s. This African-American family, very prominent in Auburn. And he was very proud of that beautiful brickwork, which cannot be replaced. No bricks look like it, and nobody can do it like he did it. In the early spring of 2006, a tour of the President's formal garden was part of the first Art and Bloom event to promote the JCS Museum. And everyone wanted to know about statuary, which nobody knew about, but we did find that there are two versions of Hebes, the Greek goddess of youth and bringer of nectar to the gods on Mount Olympus. And it's the classical version with the top on, and the neoclassical with the bare breast. But it's the same goddess. Today, the pool end of the garden has been cleaned and repaired, so there's now an operable fountain spouting every day. And at Christmas time, we have these beautiful Christmas trees with an orange light on the one at the garden and a blue light in the one in front of the house. In this collage, the Walkers and Richardsons have been left off because we probably won't get to discuss them, but we will try to do the best we can. The Duncan family. This picture was taken in 1935 when Dr. Duncan became president of API, and you can see that the children were adults, not yet married. They did not live with their parents, and the house in the background is Cater Hall. This is 3 years before the president's new home was built. Luther Duncan graduated from API in 1900, and Annie Smith graduated from Livingston Normal School in Livingston, Alabama in 1901. The Duncans met and married when they were both teaching high school in Wetumpka. Their backgrounds were very different. Luther was a farm boy, and Annie the daughter of a Livingston attorney and member of a socially prominent family. Mrs. Duncan was also a teacher of elocution. And we have her granddaughter, Ann Pearson, with us today to testify that Mrs. Duncan never gave up on that endeavor to teach people how to speak correctly. In 1978, Miss Pearson, who is a local historian and writer, remembered her grandmother's appreciation for proper speaking. I need Mrs. Duncan here to teach me elocution, and proper entertaining. Here she speaks of her grandmother's love of the poetry of Sir Walter Scott. I think she was especially fond of Sir Walter Scott because he inevitably and eternally rhymed off. You want to read that, Anne? She broke me in on the delicacies of oral delivery. You could probably do a much better job with The Lady of the Lake, and she encouraged me to commit long passages to memory and to recite them. Luther Duncan grew up in Franklin County near Russellville on a rural North Alabama farm his granddaughter describes as very modest and out in the middle of nowhere. He was born in 1875, only 10 years after the end of the Civil War that devastated the South and left hundreds of farmers in acute hardship. In 1896, Luther came to Auburn and lived with his brother George, who was principal of Auburn Grammar School, and George's wife Julia, who held every position of leadership Auburn could offer and was a strong influence in every life that touched hers. Duncan was an honors graduate and president of his class. In 1905, when the Duncans returned to Auburn with their 2 young daughters, Mary Elizabeth and Margaret Susan, their son Robert was born in Auburn. Luther Duncan had returned to his alma mater to begin a long career with the Alabama Cooperative Extension. During the 15 years before Dr. Duncan became head of the Extension Service, he earned a master's degree, taught agriculture at API, and spread the ideals of the land-grant college throughout the state of Alabama. In 1920, after the death of President Thatch, Governor Kilby appointed State Superintendent of Education. You see it's happened before. Sprite Dowell, president of API, and Dowell chose Duncan as director of Alabama Cooperative Extension Service. The appointment was the turning point for Dr. Duncan. As head of Extension, he organized the Alabama Farm Bureau, the state branch of the American Farm Bureau that provided cooperative purchasing and marketing for Alabama farmers. And as you know, that's today an insurance company primarily called Alpha. In 1910, and go back, that's Dr. Duncan speaking at the dedication of Duncan Hall. Did I skip right over the dedication of Duncan Hall? But anyway, the Duncan Hall that's on College Street is named for Dr. Duncan, and that's the dedication of it in 1929. You can see President Thatch on the end with his paper and pen, Mrs. Duncan next to him, and Dr. Duncan speaking. In 1910, the Duncans had built a home on Opelika Road. This shows you how good Dr. Duncan was at choosing sites for home sites, because that home stood where the U.S. Post Office now stands, where you and I go and mail the Christmas cards. And I wanted to show you this because this is Margaret Susan, and you remember she came with them to Auburn, but she died at the age of 19. And Mrs. Duncan's grief lasted throughout her life and altered her perspective on religion. She became a Christian Scientist, a member of the Christian Science Church, and attended meetings until her death in 1951. President Duncan was an Auburn son. When President Knapp resigned, many people wanted Luther Duncan to be the president, but Governor Miller was there then at that time, and he created a triumvirate. And Duncan was one of 3 who governed Auburn for 3 years. He was finally made president in 1935, and when Bibb Graves came back into office, they were good friends. It pays to be good friends with the incoming governor, I guess. His election took place at the state capitol, Dr. Duncan's did, on February 22nd, 1935. And before his election, all 3 members of the triumvirate had been awarded honorary doctorates. Okay. At 7 o'clock, the town siren sounded, and a great concourse of people led by the mayor flocked to the mansion where President and Mrs. Duncan received them in front of their future home. Can you imagine that now? In accepting the presidency, Dr. Duncan spoke of his days as a student at API during the administration of his mentor, President Leroy Brown. "From these great teachers, I caught the spirit of Auburn," he said, "which to me is the spirit of growth and progress, the spirit of helpfulness and service, the spirit of equality of opportunity, which is real democracy." Now, Laura, being the artist she is, just insisted that we have this because this was a part of Dr. Duncan's other side, you might say. He commissioned these paintings by John Augustus Walker in 1939 to glorify and amplify and make people appreciate the hard life of the farmer. And Laura, would you like to tell us a little more about that?
As Mrs. Richardson said, the murals were commissioned by Dr. Luther Duncan in 1939 to be shown at the Alabama State Fair in Birmingham. And the murals were brought back here but vanished for many, many years until they were discovered under a tarp up in the attic of Duncan Hall in 1980. And one of the Sesquicentennial lectures was actually on the Walker murals, which are stored down in the archives now.
On becoming president of API, Dr. Duncan credited his mother, his wife, and his sister-in-law for his success. He came to Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical College and graduated from Alabama Polytechnic Institute. Can you imagine? It happened to my husband, too. He came to API and graduated from Auburn University. But President Brown was a scholar who believed that the land-grant ideal should be championed and that the college could be more than a liberal arts college and more than an agricultural and mechanical college. So he thought it was a college of many technologies as well as an ideal liberal arts education. We'll talk a little bit about Mrs. Duncan's character. From the 20s through the 40s, she gave numerous teas and receptions. And on the social page of every newspaper in the town, including the Plainsman. Can you imagine that the Plainsman in those days cited all of the teas that the president's wife gave? I don't think they know there is a president's wife now, but no. And we found some of the most interesting events given by Mrs. Duncan imaginable. And we pulled out some of the quotes. This reciprocity tea, where I think that means that they change officers of the club. And you can see that Mrs. Drawn was in assistance in hosting some of these. So they called upon each other to host a lot of these things. Can you imagine Dr. Duncan gave a war rally in front of the president's home during World War II? Things like this just don't happen, but they all have happened at that president's home. Amazing. But the reason we have Mrs. Duncan in the background hooking rugs is because Ann told me she also loved to hook rugs and was very good at it. I still have several of her best efforts here at the house. Mrs. Duncan remained active in the DAR and in the Auburn Women's Club throughout her life. At some point, she became a rather good amateur artist. One of her still lifes of magnolias still hangs in the parlor of the Women's Club, and Ann has several others hanging in the family home today. Maybe she'll invite us all out to see them. Mrs. Duncan was always prepared to entertain in the manner required of the times. This is she at a tea at the University of Alabama. That's the president's home at the University of Alabama. And I can assure you our president's home looks a whole lot better. Anne tells about her grandmother's love of little girls to have a silver service in their hope chest. And so I will read that quote. My grandmother and I remained at odds about Christmas presents. At the time of my birth, she'd picked out a silver pattern for me, Chantilly, a good, solid, never out-of-stock design and just the thing for a girl's hope chest. And every Christmas and birthday, I got another piece. And though I didn't think much of that silver then, I know now she gave me a dowry of considerable price and other intangible things that took deep root, such as one of the most priceless gifts of all, a love of the written word. And you just need to read Anne's, in the book, I'll have Anne's whole article about her grandmother. Ralph remembers Anne's grandmother as well.
Luckily for Auburn University, its president's home had for several decades a butler, Jim Smith, who impressed all visitors with his courtesy, his demeanor, and his bearing. Butlers currently are in short supply, and I'm sure that no billionaire today has a butler to compare with Jim. In one of her many important contributions to life in the president's home, Ms. Duncan had trained him very ably, and he turned out to be an apt pupil. If memory serves me, she preferred to call him James, but the Drawns all called him Jim because, I suppose, we were too fond of him to be formal.
And this man was beloved for 30 years by the Philpotts, the Drawns, and the Duncans. This is Dr. Duncan in the sunroom with the lecture, and this is his casket. He lay in state there after he died of a heart attack for 2 days. And this is he starting the freshman picnic. As you can see, it was the freshmen coming to a picnic at the president's home, and they had watermelon. I thought it was very good, and it shows you how the first freshman picnic got started, perhaps, especially at the President's Home. Okay, let's see. Let me read you just a bit of this. Ralph Drawn, then Director of Instruction, reported that Dr. Duncan had died the morning at Drake Infirmary. And Laura's going to flip you past the old Drake, but Drake was one of the buildings that Dr. Duncan had constructed in 1939. It's just recently been torn down. On the Friday before his death, Dr. Duncan had gone from the President's Home to his office in Sanford Hall and worked for about 2 hours, and then visited with his office staff, smiling and chuckling over some of the day's problems. In the meeting held by the Council of Deans after Dr. Duncan's death, Dean Marion Funchess recalled the philosophy of Dr. Duncan as he had expressed it in 1939. The great problem of Alabama is that of low income of her people, and lower incomes are found among the farm families of the state. To this end, all the efforts of the Alabama Polytechnic Institute through teaching, extension, and research are bent toward improving farm life through better farm practices, conservation of soil, and conservation of human lives. His favorite spot on the campus was the Graves Amphitheater, and that's where his funeral took place. More than 2,000 people gathered to pay respects. 4 years later, on Dr. Duncan's birthday, Mrs. Duncan died of a heart attack. And her funeral was conducted in the parlor of her home by a Christian Science reader, and that home would be Ann's home today, which is a historical treasure, Noble Hall. Now we move to the Drawns, and I want you to look at what a beautiful family came. This is the Drawn family in the small den of the President's Home in 1949. Ralph Jr. was 11 and 16. After a year of being interim president, Dr. Drawn had been named president. He was appointed acting president in 1947, and he and Mrs. Drawn worked with the trustee committee in a nationwide search of outstanding business executives, educational administrators, and others who were candidates for president of API. Mrs. Drawn talks about getting $2.50 to entertain these folks in her home, her small home, before she moved in the President's Home, for each person, and she had to use her own china and silver. They had no idea, and were very surprised when Governor Big Jim Folsom appointed Dr. Drawn to be president of API. We lost that quote. We had a quote, but we have to just go over it. After World War II, Ralph was responsible for rebuilding the college faculty and providing housing and educational opportunities for the thousands of students who enrolled during those years. The GI Bill had inundated API with students, doubling enrollment twice between 1944 and 48. API's physical plant and faculty were too small to handle the onslaught effectively. Throughout his tenure, Drawn worked with state and federal officials to get building and operating funds to improve campus facilities and its faculty. Pebble Hill. Caroline Marshall, born in 1910, was almost 11 years younger than Ralph, and they did not marry until after her graduation in 1931. They were wed in Orville and came back to Auburn, where Ralph had been a temporary teaching position given to him by George Petrie, a dean of history at API. And the Drawns rented an apartment upstairs in what is now Greystone, and their children were delivered by Cecil Yarber, Dr. Cecil Yarber, who lived in this home, which is now Pebble Hill, part of the campus at the end of Magnolia. The person died that Dr. Drawn was substituting for, and Dr. Drawn became a permanent professor of history in Dr. Petrie's department. The Drawn's children, Anne, born in 1932, and Ralph Jr., born in 1935, were delivered by Dr. Cecil Yarber. The young Drawn family, like most of the API faculty during the Depression, often went without pay or with only a partial salary and were forced to live on credit for groceries at Hudson's Grocery and their medicines at Homer Wright's Grocery. When Ralph Drawn became secretary of the Board of Trustees under Dr. Duncan, the life of the Drawns improved. Drawn's eloquent testimony to the philosophy and character of Dr. Duncan in 1935 showed the respect Ralph held for Dr. Duncan as president. Dr. Duncan paid off Auburn's debts, and he began to pay the faculty for the first time in several years. And so they all loved him. I mean, when you get a check, you're kind of happy. Ralph Drawn was inaugurated on May 12, 1949. Note the hats on the ladies. In Cliff Hair Stadium. This is the breakfast. According to the Auburn Plainsman of that day, the ceremonies were colorful and a host of guests, and several thousand alumni were in attendance. It's a big job for a fisherman, Dr. Drawn said. And the Auburn Alum News described Caroline as the good wife standing behind the man and said she sews well, cooks well, and can even dress a string of fish caught by her fisherman husband. Ralph Drawn was a native of Hartford, Alabama, born in 1900, graduated from API in 1922. He's another Auburn man. Taught history before becoming principal of a new school in Orville, Caroline's hometown, where they were introduced to each other, but they re-met in Auburn in the summer of 1929 when they both lived in boarding houses, if you can believe that. Ralph was living upstairs at Miss Cora Hardy's, and Caroline had rented a room from Dr. and Ms. Isaac McAdora and took her meals at Miss Gertrude Lane's boarding house on Gay Street.
I entertained many candidates of this caliber in my small home, using my own silver and china and so forth. But with the help of my faithful cook and friend Ruth Dallas and Jim Smith, the business office allowed me $2.50 for each guest, a far cry from what is permitted today, I'm sure.
This just shows some scenes of Mrs. Drawn, First Lady, wife, mother, hostess at the woodchopper's ball, can you believe? Dressing the string of fish at the cabin at Lake Martin, in her garden, which she had to give up, Ralph says, Ralph Jr., because the duties got too hectic, and trying to relax in that small den. Now we have the sunroom.
Ecstatic Jim Smith was returned to the house as butler and chauffeur, and what wonderful help he was. He loved his job and asked permission to wear white gloves when he served dinner for guests, but I assured him we had not reached that status.
For that year, Jim had to go somewhere else on campus and work because he was an employee of Auburn University. So she says an ecstatic Jim Smith was returned to the home. That was his home, and so he was very happy, and they, of course, the Drawns were very happy.
My sister, Ann, was not at all happy about moving into the president's home, and she felt some alarm in one early incident at the house when my parents honored the new governor of Alabama, Big Jim Folsom, with a reception in the formal garden. People today probably don't realize what a sensation Big Jim created when he first arrived on the political scene. He seemed larger than life. For the reception in his honor, he showed up early, but while the last-minute preparations for the event were being made, he disappeared. Nobody was sure where he had gone, and my 16-year-old sister was dispatched to find him. She finally traced him to an upstairs guest room where he was taking a nap, fully clothed and with his shoes still on. Anne was really, really scared, but she delivered her message and fled.
I think he took a lot in when he was a little boy, don't you? Okay, and here we have Mrs. Drawn was president and began so many clubs, I cannot tell you. The Campus Club, the Newcomers Club, the Dames Club. The Dames Club was the most interesting organization. Had to be abandoned today because it probably would have seemed a little sexist, because it was a very interesting club given for the wives who were helping their husbands get through Auburn. They were working and the husbands were going to school. It was organized by Caroline Drawn to help out these girls whom she wanted to include in the campus life and to give some fun to. And she even created a degree for them called the PHT, which meant pushing hubby through. And she gave them, at the end of the graduation ceremony, a certificate for their contribution. The diploma praised the wife's willingness to make a home in a few small rooms, to wear old hose and pretend there were no runs, to spend late hours typing hubby's thesis instead of dancing under the stars. The wives were praised as the light of his life when he needed you to shine the brightest. So she did everything she could to make them feel good about having to work and send their husbands to school. She also gave an Easter egg hunt every spring for the children of these young women. And you see her standing in front of the CDV. Mrs. Strong did so much for the married students and the veterans' families that when the married student housing, which was built in Dr. Strawn's term for these people, they had to build housing quickly. In '65, they named it for Mrs. Strawn, and it has been known affectionately as the CDV ever since. Now it's about to be torn down, I'm told, and the new women's dorms and their parking spaces will be there.
Ralph and Jeff Beard, the athletic director, set up a committee to hire a new coach. Many names were considered, but it all ended one Sunday afternoon with the committee meeting in my sunroom. No news reporters were allowed at the meeting, but they were all settled with me in the kitchen, butler's pantry, and garage. No two people were more excited over the selection of Coach Shug Jordan than Bill Beckwith and I. Shug and I had attended Selma High School together and finished in the same class.
You recognize the sunroom? The Drawn's daughter, Ann, had been a very popular cheerleader at Lee County High School, and her popularity continued during her student days at API. She was among the campus beauties, selected by Powers and Associates in 1951. She graduated in 1954, still a very beautiful alum, serving on the It Begins at Auburn fundraising campaign. And this is at the President's home. This is the beauties. We can't find Ann in the group, but we know she's there somewhere, we think.
In the very late 50s, Ralph felt that our university needed an outstanding library in order to be fully accredited. He asked Miss Kate Lane, Dr. Petrie's sister-in-law, and her very wealthy niece in New York to donate the Petrie Lane property for the building and planned to name the library after Dr. Petrie. The ladies refused, and the university had to buy the property. My children and I are grateful that this building stands today as a memorial to a man who really loved and struggled for this institution.
And don't they look good after they've retired? Rested, and the sweet grandchildren, and there you are, Ralph, looking very handsome in the background. Changing of the guard.
Ralph and I knew he needed to retire. Dr. Philpott had been one of the many fine educator speakers at commencement. So my husband suggested to Frank Sanford Sr., chairman of the selection committee, that Dr. Philpott be considered for the position as president. The Philpotts were interviewed and agreed to come to Auburn. And Miss Polly, as we say in the Episcopal Church, thanks be to God, and the same to the gracious Cratus Bailey and the vivacious Ann Martin.
These are from her memoirs, Caroline Drawn's memoirs. The stress of working with the legislature contributed to the 1955 heart attack of Dr. Drawn, and after he retired, he died of a massive heart attack in 1967. He retired in 1965, died in 1967. He is buried at Pine Hill. Mrs. Drawn died in 2005. She's buried there too. After his retirement, Dr. Drawn had an office in this library where he had planned to write a history of Auburn. Unfortunately, we don't have that gift because of his untimely death. And now we go to the Philpott family. What a beautiful family. The Philpotts met in divinity school at Yale. They were married in Riverside Church in New York in 1943. When the Philpott family moved into the AU President's home in '65, they had home air conditioning, turned the back porch into a Florida room. The younger Philpott son, Cabell, was a 7th grader, and the younger daughter, Virginia Gingy, was 10 and an elementary student in the 5th grade. Jean Todd remembers being a member of the first graduating class at the new Auburn High School. She's with us today. So happy to have her. Melvin was a sophomore at Yale and only visited the home. But there they were, 3, and you know he came back for his mom to wash clothes for him. So, this is a quote from a newspaper. Newly enclosed porch bears witness to the children. It's not unusual to see a picture puzzle spread out on the table, a book, half a dozen sprawling youngsters. The 4 young Philpotts will be on hand on May 13th to see Daddy inaugurated as the 11th president of Auburn University. That year, Melvin sang with a college group called the Spin Winds. Jean loved sports and taught synchronized swimming at Brevard in the summer. Cabell sang with the Auburn's All-State Choral Group and played tackle on the undefeated junior high school football team. He was a trophy-winning golfer and proficient with the Philpott sailboat. The Drons suggested that they too get a house to escape to up at the lake, which they did, and I think many happy times were spent up there. Gingy played golf and tennis and took ballet as well as piano and violin lessons. Dr. Dron's man. In August '64, the Board of Trustees had 4 strong candidates, and Dr. Philpott was not among them. But Dr. Dron wanted Dr. Philpott, and so, after 10 months, Dr. Dron's man was chosen. The selection of Dr. Philpott was announced in the Auburn Plainsman of May 12, 1965. Governor George C. Wallace and Trustee Frank Sanford, in a joint statement officially announcing Dr. Philpott's election, said Philpott was well qualified to head the university both because of his educational background and his experience as first vice president of the University of Florida, which is a land-grant institution. Dr. Philpott said he had been particularly impressed with the school spirit of Auburn on his visits to the campus, and Mrs. Philpott and the children were looking forward to coming to Auburn, he said. Mrs. Pauline Polly Philpott was born in New York on December 12, 1915. Her father was a Presbyterian minister and served as chaplain at Cornell University. Having lived in Switzerland for some time, Polly spoke fluent French and spoke and preached sermons after graduation, and when in the summer that she was in Canada, serving with the YWCA and YMCA. Mrs. Philpott was baptized, however, baptized shortly after her marriage by her husband, an ordained Baptist minister. So she had to give up that Presbyterian stuff and become a Baptist. Dr. Harry Melvin Philpott was born May 6, 1917, in Bassett, Virginia, and Ritter, North Carolina. He was graduated from Washington Lee University in 1938 with a Bachelor of Arts degree cum laude. His major field of study was religion and higher education, with extensive work in philosophy and psychology. He was the winner of the Tew Prize for Outstanding Work in Ethics in 1941 and was designated a Yale University Scholar in 1941-43. In 1947, Dr. Philpott joined the faculty of the University of Florida as professor of religion and organized the Religion in Life program, which received a Freedom Foundation Award. Slide 70.
Yes, it was a great little organization, and in a period that the world was a much different place. No pantsuits or slacks. We dressed up in what would be our Sunday best. There were teas and monthly meetings, more as a reason to support and comfort one another, as most of us were working wives while pushing hubby through. Our diploma certificates earned at the time of our husband's graduation carried a seal and were signed by Mrs. Philpott, president, and Mrs. Evelyn Jordan, vice president. We had a service project each year, and one such project was raising funds to purchase little red wagons with the wooden slats to place in the pediatric wing of East Alabama Medical Center. The wagons were used to carry children to X-ray in the operating room. It proved to be a big success, and even today I understand they continue to use the wagons.
Mrs. Philpott took over the Dames Club for these wives who were pushing their husbands through. And we have a person who works for Auburn University today who was a member of that and had some very fond remembrances of Mrs. Philpott. This is Polly on the porch and Polly in the garden. And she looks so happy with those flowers. She loved to work outside with flowers and in the garden, rose garden, which Jean tells me she liked the rose garden that nobody could see, so she could leave the roses on there even when they started losing their petals. At this point, we lose Jim. Dr. Philpott told me recently when I visited him that on the last day Jim worked at the President's home, he and Mrs. Philpott heard Jim coming up the back stairs early one morning, which was most unusual. Jim came to the bedroom door and said he couldn't fix breakfast that morning because he didn't feel well and he needed to go home. He went home and he never returned. At the funeral service for Jim Smith, Dr. Philpott, an ordained Baptist minister, gave the eulogy. Among those attending were Dr. Duncan's granddaughter, Ann Pearson. Jean Philpott Baxter and her father recently remembered the day he died, and Jean remembered that when she was a teenager, Jim kept all the cars filled with gasoline, and he would be waiting to pick me up from school and would come around and open the door for me. Rapping with the students. On the 5th year of Dr. Philpott's president, the Plainsman featured the Philpott family in its May 14th, 1971 edition. President Philpott spent the afternoon of his birthday in Sanford Park, May 6, rapping with a small, constantly shifting group of students about university policies, discipline, parking areas, outdoor loudspeakers, and the dispensation of birth control pills. Most significant and controversial change during Dr. Philpott's presidency was probably AUM. And it was in 1966, the Montgomery Chamber of Commerce sought the establishment of AUM, and in early 67, Auburn agreed to open that campus branch. And Governor Lurleen B. Wallace signed the bill that gave the money, the $5 million worth, to do it, and it opened on September 16th, 1969. Here is Diane's quote again about Mrs. Philpott and what a lovely person she was. And I want you to look at all the things she was engaged in as First Lady. This is Mrs. Terrell, had a boarding house here for years. This beautiful young lady, the blonde in the striped dress, is Dean Foy's daughter, who Mrs. Philpott gave a reception for. And guess who that is front and center? Dean Cater.
I vividly recall newspapers of every major city being stacked everywhere and up high. Both Dr. and Mrs. Philpott were avid readers, and our group would just clear enough space to sit and enjoy Polly's latest story of life with Harry or whatever guest she had recently entertained. She enjoyed telling how she would ask Ted Kennedy, Bob Hope, and other presidents about writing on her tablecloth. Of course, most were taken back with such a request, and she would insist that their names were needed on her cloth of fame. With pen in hand, each VIP guest would scroll their name, and she would later hand embroider over their signature. She was totally unpretentious. I always got the sense she was Dr. Philpott's closest and most trusted friend, and said whatever was on her mind.
Okay, we have Jean Todd's wedding. And Jean, we did not know. We have two versions, so we hope we spelled your name correctly. We thought since that was the French version, that might be right. In 1975, two major events took place in the Philpott lives. Jean Todd's wedding, which the pictures speak for themselves, except for this one. And guess who this is in the corner here? This is Mrs. Drone doing her bird calls. She was famous for being able to make bird calls and sound like the birds. Obviously, she could do more than just string the fish. The other major thing in 1975 was the honor, the 10-year honor of Dr. and Mrs. Mrs. Philpott in the 65-75 Decade of Progress, which the Chamber of Commerce gave in Dr. Philpott's honor in in September 1975. 400 guests saluted Dr. Philpott at a banquet sponsored by the Auburn Chamber of Commerce. And many, many, many accomplishments were cited, many fine comments were made, a wonderful event. Some of the changes to the campus during the Philpotts' first 5 years at Auburn were construction of Memorial Coliseum, Haley Center, 2 veterinary medicine buildings, 2 women's dorms, Cliff Air Stadium increased, and the Forestry Building, Fine Arts Center, Auburn Union. ROTC became voluntary. The rules for women were changing, and a Centrex telephone system was installed, as were private telephones in girls' dorms. On May 8, 1975, Mrs. Philpott said that she thought that the Vietnam War era was changing, and she thought the students were becoming more serious about their studies. And she expressed a belief in the principle that giving was better than receiving, and she thought that many Auburn students seemed to live by this motto because of the things they did, like participation in blood drives and funds raising for humanitarian causes. This is the family coming home with the grandchildren, and I hate to tell you this, but both of the young men you see, the Philpott sons, died as young men. Melvin in a car accident, and Cable with an illness. Older daughter Jean Todd, seated with the baby on her lap, named for her mother's sister, who was related to Mary Todd Lincoln. Graduated from Auburn University in 1972 and taught secondary math for 34 years. The Philpotts' younger daughter, Gingy, graduated from Briarcliff College and earned an MS from Columbia. She's been an accountant for many years in Manufacturers Hanover Bank in New York City, where she still lives. The Philpotts have 3 grandsons and 1 granddaughter. Their son, Cabell, has this baby son, his wife seated in front of him is holding, and a younger son who is now a student at Auburn University in forestry. He was at the homecoming game the other day. Big guy, very big. And there you can see our president looking very handsome. This is in the den. Philpotts retired to 626 Cary Drive, a street neighborhood named for Dr. Charles Allen Cary, who established the AU Vet School. The family treasures that once graced the president's home can still be found there, even though Mrs. Philpott died in September 2004. Dr. John Jeffers, pastor of the First Baptist Church of Auburn during the Philpott tenure, conducted the funeral service and said, "As Auburn's First Lady, Polly fulfilled that role with grace and charm and was loved and appreciated by the entire Auburn family, but her ultimate devotion was to her home and her family." In her last interview, she talked about the changes in that she hoped Mrs. Funderburg would take care of when she came on as First Lady. What a beautiful family, the Funderburgs. Dr. and Ms. Funderburg moved into the President's home in the spring of 1980. Their children were young adults living on their own. We are running so out of time that I think I may just skip a whole bunch of this and just go to the slides. What do you think, Laura? And I will just kind of more or less ad-lib. They were both Hanley and Helen Hanson were born in Carrollton, Alabama, in rural Pickens County. And Dr. Funderburg was another Auburn man. He had graduated from Alabama Polytechnic Institute in '53 with a degree in agricultural science. He went to the Army, second lieutenant. He married his hometown sweetheart. He came back to get his master's degree from Auburn. And he went then with his wife to get his PhD at LSU. And he came back to Auburn to teach and do research at Auburn. The Funderburgs with their young children, Deborah Lane, 5, and Kenneth Cleft, only a year old, returned to Auburn. And there you see them grown up. He rose quickly. Dr. Funderburg did to become assistant dean of the graduate school, where he guided the planning and development of Auburn AUM. And he was appointed vice president and chief administrative officer, and then in '78, chancellor of AUM. In the 1980s, when he came to be president of Auburn, finally chosen after a year of contentious debate among the board. And we've moved right past that, but that's him and that's AUM. And here is that sunroom, and guess whose furniture that still is in 1980? Guess who picked that furniture out? Mrs. Drong in 1948. So you see, without money, we don't get to redecorate either. But Mrs. Funderburk did some redecorating and was able to make some changes. Okay? Don't we have a quote with that mention of activities? Or I'm reading that quote, right? Okay. In October 1980, she was well seasoned to the entertaining, biggest crowd ever at the freshman picnic, which you see on the backyard. She gave credit to the success of that to lots of people. She expressed a desire to become personally acquainted with the AU faculty and to have the faculty to her home, but she knew she couldn't do that because that faculty was much bigger than the faculty at AUM. Grace Jones, interviewing Ms. Funderburk for the September 14, 1980 bulletin, said Helen seemed completely at ease in the beautiful redecorated President's home, but she was faced with a mansion of activities. And she had already 2 receptions, graduating seniors, their parents, their friends. She had completed the planning for the annual freshman picnic and was expecting 1,700 guests on September 22nd. She was so busy with working with a committee to plan the annual fall faculty reception to be held in the President's home in October. Ms. Jones asked how she felt about her husband, and she said it's certainly a challenge and he's thrilled with it, but she wondered if they were going to have time to do anything they'd enjoy doing, like play golf.
I guess one of the most interesting things that happened during the first year that we were at Auburn was hiring a football coach. My husband and the trustees were interviewing during the Thanksgiving holidays before the big Auburn-Alabama game. We had our extended family in Auburn for Thanksgiving and were trying to have dinner. Reporters were actually climbing trees around the house trying to see if there was a prospective football coach there. The doorbell rang multiple times during dinner. We coped as best we could, but it was an interesting time.
And that coach was, of course, Pat Dye. Okay.
The real experience was having the Secret Service in the kitchen checking out the food. President Ford was most gracious, and the people traveling with him were very polite and respectful of the private dinner.
You can see the dining room of the home. That's Dr. Funderburk's back. You can see one of the board members of that time, Mr. Savage. You can see President Ford. You can see new Coach Dye and his wife, and lots of other people that I'm sure all of you may know at that dinner. This is the old skybox that the presidents once sat in. We now have a beautiful skybox enclosed, but
We also had President George H.W. Bush for a football game while he was running for office. Unfortunately, he was stung by a bee while watching the game, was allergic to bee stings, and had to be rushed to the doctor. Thankfully, everything turned out all right.
he didn't die. He went on to be president, and we know his son became president as well. These two, you saw the two astronauts. The Funderburks were very happy to get to go see them lift off into space, and they came back and brought a flag and a picture. Guess what? In this picture is going on. Auburn's 125th birthday took place in Dr. Funderburk's tenure. And both of their children graduated from Auburn, and he was there to award them their degree. Okay?
Christmas of that year, Gary Trentham, a professor in textile designs, designed and made the ornaments and decorated the tree and a wreath for the president's home. This tree and wreath were featured in the Southern Living magazine, I believe, the next year.
And in speaking of this, Mrs. Funderburk told me that she loved to entertain small groups, but she also had to entertain a lot of large groups and to suspend her private life for events even when the birth of her first grandchild was pending. She was giving a large party on the lawn of the president's home to introduce Mrs. Pat Dye, the new football coach's wife, to the community when she got the call that her daughter had gone into labor. And this is the baby. And now we have the wonderful Bailey family, who never lived in the home, but what a beautiful family. Mrs. Bailey is here today, and these are her 4 gorgeous children. She almost was an only child, had a sibling when she was 15 years old, and she said she never wanted have an only child, so she's just going to have 4. And she'd had 4 pretty ones, didn't she? And let's see. They were all married and living gainfully employed and had children when the Baileys when Dr. Bailey served Auburn as interim president. He was clever. He said, "I'm coming 1 year, and so y'all find somebody." And they didn't move into the house. Now this is a picture of Dr. Bailey when he was a young man. He has a very interesting story. His mother sold the family farm and came to Auburn so that he could go to the vet school. And he did go to the vet school, and he became a veterinarian. And this is his mother. She got a job working for Auburn. She was the telephone operator for many years. They wanted to come because of Dr. Carey's work, and she wanted her sons to both go to the vet school. I'm going to kind of skip pretty much all this wonderful, wonderful stuff about the character of Dr. Bailey and the character of Mrs. Bailey. Mrs. Bailey was born in a log cabin and grew up a farm lady and worked for the Farm Extension Service, which that's how she met Dr. Bailey. She came here to take some summer courses so that she could work with the extension, and Dr. Bailey was living here, and they met at the Church of Christ, which used to stand where the Checkers hamburger place is today. And she went back to work, a job she loved the whole time she was there. She was born in a log cabin in Dodd Hollow in Franklin County. And but she tells me about her job when she went back to help the struggling farmers fill out forms for government subsidized loans, and teaching them how to use a pressure cooker and how to preserve food from their gardens and how to make clothes from feed sacks, how to cull out chickens not laying, and how to rid fleas from under their houses. She regretted the discourtesy of other agents who honked their horn at the poor farmer's field and made him leave his plow and come sign the papers. But she loved her job, but she came back, married Dr. Bailey, and had 4 children, and had to give that career up. And Dr. Bailey, has a marvelous career with Auburn University. And this is that famous Christmas. And I want to tell you just a little bit about that Christmas, get you into it. They didn't live in the home, but they came there one Christmas. We packed our bags and went to live in the mansion for weekends, especially the weekends we entertained many different groups there. And our special treat was to spend the Christmas week of '83 there with our whole family.
During this time, the temperature was 7 degrees and the fountains on campus froze in midair. Also, we were unaware that a basement window was broken and almost gone, leaving freezing weather coming in the basement. Therefore, with all 16 of us in the house, our water pipes froze. We had no water anywhere in the house, but with building and grounds, things returned to normal.
And I can't name all of these wonderful people, but you can see their 4 sons, their sons-in-law, their daughters. I mean, their 2 daughters, their 2. This is Papa and Grandmama, is that right? Papa and Grandmama, and little Lizzie, who's now more than 6 feet tall, and Miles with the blue shirt on, and Joe, the son, and his daughter Marcia, his wife Marcia, and the daughter, Sarah, and her baby Hunter, standing by her husband Ken Clark, and have I missed anybody? Son Edward over here in the dark suit, white shirt, and his wife Cheryl, and daughter Margaret Newcomb, and her son Luke, and her husband Will. Okay, let's go please to just shows you some of the duties he had to perform anyway in that year. And then we have the Martin. I wish I could tell you the whole story of Miss Bailey, but we are so short on time. I'll have to let you read the book when it comes out. Okay. Dr. Martin came in, and at the time he came in, they did give Dr. Dr. Bailey, they made him president, gave him the title, which was absolutely earned and deserved. And Dr. Martin had the honor of bestowing that robe on him. And let me see what I can do with the Martins quickly. We got so many good slides, I cannot tell you. The Martins were Auburn people too, and they met at Auburn when they were both on the Auburn teams. She was a cheerleader, Ann, and he was a center for the basketball team. And this is when they came back on the Auburn team as president and his wife and Tiger, I believe. I hope that's Tiger. It's one of the golden eagles that fly every year. And I wanted to back up and just tell you that all the children of the family were, the three children, they left them in college when they moved into the president's home. And this is in that sunroom again, giving their first interview with the press, and she's talking about all the things that she loves to do, and he's talking about all those that he loves to do. And you can see then his inauguration and there's Dr. Philpott there to honor him. And George Wallace now is doing the honors, but from his wheelchair. Dr. Martin loved the tinkering with cars. He could play the piano by ear, as we say. And Dr. Martin is the president who started that alumni tags. And those car tags that we now love to buy, the revenue from those car tags is now approaching $20 million. Their daughter married from the home, and Mrs. Martin also gave a tea for Sonny Smith's daughter here. You see Mrs. Evelyn Jordan here coming in the door, President's home, at that tea for Sonny Smith's daughter. We did find out as much as we could about these old photos. Jill married, and she had a baby born on the 4th of July named Taylor Ray Ann, also known as Firecracker. Teamwork, many things to do, many things to do for the president and his wife, and this Auburn team always seemed to be a team. In 1992, March 92, they bid fond farewell to Auburn and were honored on Valentine's Day in 1984. At the university event was held to say goodbye. More than 500 alumni, faculty, staff, students crowded the Auburn University Hotel and Conference Center to pay tribute. Many things were built during his time, but you'll just have to wait and get the book. Muse family, beautiful family, came to us from Akron, Ohio, where Dr. Muse had served as president for that institution. Mrs. Muse worked for was introduced to Auburn and the campus at Emily Leeschuk's home, and this is the former First Ladies, Mrs. Strong. In her later years, Mrs. Martin, Mrs. Bailey, and Mrs. Philpott. And they welcomed Mrs. Muse into Auburn in 1992 when the Muses came here. Their children were grown and gainfully employed, and their daughter Amy, who lived up in Ohio, tried to get her parents to have a fundraiser for the organization she worked for, because there was a group up there calling themselves the Frozen Eagles. And those Frozen Eagles wanted to have a trip to Auburn and go to a game. So they wanted their parents, Dr. and Miss Muse, to hold a raffle for a ticket to come to a weekend in Auburn. And in that time, one of the things that happened was the fire. This is when the house caught fire. And when the house was restored, it cost $200,000 just to restore it. Now, when Mrs. Nutter interviewed the Philpotts, she estimated at that time that the home during the Philpott era was worth about $175,000-$200,000. Well, by the time of this, it took $200,000 just to repair it. And I can tell you it's probably $2 million today. But lots of fun things happened there, and Mrs. Muse worked with the Habitat for Humanity. Dr. Philpott worked with many areas of research, and I want to back up and show Buddy Weaver, who worked for the Capital Campaign and was working for the Capital Campaign. It Begins at Auburn when he recently died. So now we are just going to show you some pictures of the Walkers and the Richardsons. And there we all are. And we're back to our research theme. And I hope you enjoy the tour at the President's Home and the reception waiting for you. Thank you so much.